In this episode,
When I asked them to help me understand why they were smoking so much marijuana, the number one answer that came back was, "It helps me with my anxiety." We know about the drug use because that's a little bit more obvious, and we focus on treating that. But unfortunately, if we don't dig a little deeper, we all too often miss the fact that that child may be struggling with an underlying mental health issue that they're using a drug or alcohol to medicate.
well, hello there. I'm Cool Gray, and this is Cool Gray in Studio A. Welcome to the podcast, especially if you're here because someone shared this with you and you are joining me for the first time. This episode is a very special one. We're in episode 21, and we're taking a little bit of a departure from our typical fare of having interesting conversations with interesting people on a wide variety of topics in hopes of stimulating deeper thought. This episode will certainly do that, but it's in the form of a public service announcement. This is a topic that really moved my heart, and that feeling only grew during my conversation with today's guest. Before we get right into the conversation, I want to share some statistics with you so that you can understand just the sheer scope of the issue of substance use and abuse in adolescents, particularly in America, which is mostly where we're confining our conversation to today. These statistics come from the National Center for Drug Abuse Statistics, and this website gets their numbers from a number of sources, reputable sources like the NIH and other such organizations that collect this data. These numbers, I assume, are fairly current. I just pulled them this morning before I sat down to record, and they are sobering, if you'll pardon just the tiniest little pun. Here they are. 21.3% of 8th graders have tried illicit drugs at least once. By the time they're in 12th grade, 46.6% of teens have tried illicit drugs. That's nearly half of our adolescent population. 11.89 million 18 to 25-year-olds used drugs last month. 4,777 Americans aged 15 to 24 died of an overdose of illicit drugs in 1 year. 7.10 million 12 to 20-year-olds report drinking last month. Among them, 60.2% report binge drinking during that period. 25.6% of 8th graders have abused alcohol at least once. 61.5% of teens have abused alcohol by 12th grade. 61.5%. 16.8% of 12th graders have 5 or more drinks in a row when consuming alcohol. And 407,000 teenagers aged 12 to 17 years met the criteria for alcohol use disorder, AUD, in the last year. I would imagine that there isn't a person in this listening audience or watching audience that has not been touched by this subject in one way or another. And if you are a parent of teenagers or you know parents of teenagers, I would encourage you to share this episode with them. There's a wealth of information to be gathered here. Most importantly, warning signs to look for that parents can sometimes miss. And even more importantly, the resource that my guest today has made available, a very easy to read guide for parents who don't know what the first step is once they've identified that their adolescent or adolescents in their household may be struggling with this issue. So we're going to go right into the conversation now. Once you've listened and watched, if you've been helped in any way or found this to be beneficial or useful, if you've shared, of all the episodes I've done so far, this is the one that I would welcome your feedback on. So wherever it is you found this episode, whether it's social media, someone emailed it to you, it's on my blog, it's on a podcast platform, or on my YouTube channel, please comment. Please let me know what this episode did in your life. I'm very interested in your feedback. So we're going to have that conversation with my guest now, who's an expert in this field. Please stay tuned on the other side for a little bit more information about what's coming up in this podcast and for my parting thought. Here we go. Richard Capriola spent 11 years working as an addictions counselor for Menninger Clinic in Houston, Texas, one of the top 10 psychiatric hospitals in the United States that specializes in the assessment, stabilization, and treatment of adults and adolescents with substance abuse and psychiatric disorders. During his tenure there, he worked in the Adolescent Treatment program and the Adult Comprehensive Psychiatric Assessment and Stabilization program, where he performed comprehensive assessments and provided individual and group counseling services to patients diagnosed with substance use disorders. Richard holds 2 master's degrees from the University of Illinois, one in business administration and one in human services with a concentration in substance abuse. Now retired, his passion for helping this vulnerable population continues through his book, The Addicted Child, A Parent's Guide to Adolescent Substance Abuse, with a companion workbook containing assessments and tests for parents to use to best help their children. I think that this is a very important subject. I'm very grateful to have you with me. Thanks for joining me today, Richard.
Thank you, Lynn. It's a pleasure to be with you, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you and have a discussion on this very important topic of adolescent substance abuse.
You know, typically I begin every interview with, let's define what it is that we're talking about. This is something that I would be very surprised to learn if there's anybody in this listening audience that has not personally been touched by this issue in one way or another. So it almost feels like it doesn't need to be defined. But let me give you an opportunity to just sort of create a boundary around what the subject matter is really all about.
I think you're absolutely right, Lynn. I think most people who listen to our discussion today have some understanding of what it means when we talk about either an adult or a child who has what we now define and diagnose as a substance use disorder. It typically involves alcohol or drugs, but basically I think most parents and most individuals are aware of when we talk about addiction or we talk about substance abuse disorders, we're talking about teenagers and adults who are abusing substances, whether they're prescribed or they get them off the street, whether it's alcohol or any of the various drugs that are out there. And many times they use these substances to medicate an underlying psychological issue. And all too often, the use of those substances disrupts not only their life, but the life of the entire family.
Absolutely true. I know that from personal experience. I noticed, I'm going to derail you for a quick second just to go down a little path in terms of semantics. You're saying we now know this as substance use disorder, and that terminology does not include the word abuse, but what we're talking about is the abuse of a substance. Are we saying by changing up the semantics that the use of it is by definition abuse, or what would be the reason for shifting away from the word substance abuse?
Well, we used to define it when we diagnosed it as either abuse or dependency. We got away from that, and we now diagnose it as a substance use disorder, and it's on a continuum of mild to moderate to severe.
Mm-hmm.
So when we diagnose an adolescent or an adult with a substance use disorder, we will designate that it's either mild, moderate, or severe. And what distinguishes those categories is not only the extent of the use, but more importantly, how disruptive the use has become in that person's life. So obviously, as you move up the continuum to mild to moderate to severe, we see far more complications, far more disruptions in the person's life. I would say that most of the teenagers that I worked with were either in the mild or the moderate category.
Mm-hmm.
We tend to see more severe use of substances in the adult population, but for the adolescent population, substance use disorders typically tended to be either mild or moderate. They did have negative consequences, but not to the extent that you would see when it graduates up to the severe category.
And the adults that you're referring to that are in that severe category, would it be an escalation from a mild or moderate adolescent use that simply grows, or are these adults, people that don't begin to express disorderly behavior until adulthood?
Many of them begin in adolescence, and then it escalates and it gets out of control as they move into adulthood.
Yeah.
And many of them, or some of them, will move from, say, smoking marijuana, and as they get older, they begin to experiment with more hardcore drugs. So definitely, um, a lot of what we refer as substance use disorder, a lot of what we call addiction, has its beginnings during the adolescent years.
How young do you normally see that beginning? What's the low end of the scale there?
I've seen it as young as 11 and 12 years of age.
Wow.
Typically, I've seen more in the mid-teen age, the 14, 15, 16, 17-year-old age group. But it does occur earlier, even preteens. So parents need to be aware that their children are vulnerable at a very young age.
And does this vulnerability manifest typically in a school environment when they're around peers that may be using and exposing them to it, or is it something that they go seeking in some other way, do you find?
Every child is different. Every situation is different. Some get exposed to it because of curiosity. They've heard about this drug, say marijuana, and they want to try it out, and they experiment with it, and they either have a good experience or a bad experience, and that determines that may decide whether they're going to continue. Others get involved because of peer influence and the friends that they're hanging around with. And then for some kids, not all, but for some kids, there may be an underlying psychological reason why that child is using a substance. And it's often to medicate an intolerable thought or feeling or memory. When I asked them to help me understand why they were smoking so much marijuana, the number one answer that came back was, it helps me with my anxiety. We know about the drug use because that's a little bit more obvious, and we focus on treating that. But unfortunately, if we don't dig a little deeper, we all too often miss the fact that that child may be struggling with an underlying mental health issue that they're using a drug or alcohol to medicate.
So at the Menninger Clinic, I typically think of treatment or recovery programs that are residential in nature, the 30, 45, 60, 90-day programs, as being for adults. I believe most of them are. They don't accept minors into those programs. Was this a residency program or an outpatient program? How was it structured for them to receive counseling and treatment at that age?
Well, Menninger is a psychiatric hospital. So many of the adolescents that were admitted into the hospital were very serious cases where parents had felt that they absolutely must admit their child to a hospital
Hmm.
for both assessment and short-term treatment.
Hmm.
Typically, the assessment and the treatment period ran a period of 3, 4, 5 weeks, and many of these kids were referred to longer-term programs after they had left Menninger. Now, since I left Menninger, they have expanded significantly, and they have added treatment options for adolescents to their programs, including an outpatient treatment program. So the services at Menninger have expanded significantly to address the needs of these young men and women.
And so you raise an important point here in that it's the parents that have identified that a problem has become disruptive or serious enough that something like a hospitalization is necessary. That's pretty extreme, and it's obvious to the parent that there is something here that requires addressing that's beyond their capacity. But I know that you and I talked before recording today that very often there are warning signs that a problem is developing with an adolescent that the parent may miss and just simply not know what to look for. What are some of those warning signs?
These warning signs are the reason that I wrote my book, The Addicted Child: A Parent's Guide to Adolescent Substance Abuse. Because many times I would sit across from a family and I would go through their child's history of using a substance, what substances they'd been using, how early they started, how often they were using, and give them a diagnosis of a substance use disorder. And the parents would look across at me and they would say, I had no idea this was going on.
Oh, wow.
Or if they did suspect their child was using a substance, they might say, I sort of thought something was going on, but I didn't think it was this bad. And these are good parents. These are very good parents doing the best job that they can. They missed the warning signs because nobody told them what to look for.
Sure.
And that was the reason why I wrote my book, because I wanted to put in warning signs for alcohol use, warning signs for marijuana use. I wanted to put in warning signs for a child that might be developing an eating disorder or might be self-harming themselves, because sometimes those will accompany a child using a substance. So these warning signs are very important for parents to know. As a general rule, what I say to parents is pay attention to the changes that you see in your child. You know your child better than anyone.
Sure.
So don't assume that the changes that you're seeing, these behavioral changes, are just adolescent acting out behaviors. They may very well be that, but they also may be a sign that there's something else going on underneath the surface that you need to pay attention to and perhaps get some assessments done. Examples would be a child whose grades are starting to decline, a child who gets into disciplinary problems at school, a child who used to participate in sports no longer shows an interest in participating in sports,
Mhm.
a child who used to introduce you to their friends, you knew who their friends were, now becomes very secretive of who their friends are and where they've been.
Mhm.
And then obviously, if you find any drug paraphernalia or you smell any strange odors from their room, these are obvious signs. So pay attention to the changes that you see in your child. If they come and go fairly quickly, they're probably not too concerning. But if they tend to linger on and you start to see more and more and more of these changes, then you might want to get some of the assessments done that I recommend in my book.
I'm sure there are a great number of parents who would be eager to get their hands on such a book, and we will talk about that a little bit more at the end of our discussion. I can't help but wonder, some of these kids that are turning to this for self-medicating purposes, and I'm reminded of children who adolescents who cut as well, or any other sort of behavior that would seem to be a way to, as unhealthy as it may be, a way to cope with emotional pain, may be in a situation where they don't have parents that care enough. They're in home life situations where they're not supported and they're not necessarily being looked after, and the parents are not responsible. They may be drug abusers themselves, or it might be a domestic violence situation. Where is the hope for kids like that?
Well, there's always hope. There's always hope that change can come about, that treatment works. We know that treatment works. The key is to identify the problem as early as possible and begin treatment as early as possible. But you bring up a very important aspect to this issue, and that is the family.
Mhm.
Many times it's not just the child who's using a substance that needs treatment. The entire family needs treatment. And most treatment programs, residential type treatment programs, will include family therapy as a part of the treatment, because many times these children will come from a dysfunctional family, and
And
the
they'll be
family.
returned to that family when they're finished with treatment.
Exactly, which
Mhm.
increases the probability that that child will relapse and get back
Yeah,
into
of course.
substances. So it's very important that the family participate in family therapy, and that the overall treatment include the family as well as the child. They both need and deserve treatment.
Did you find in your time at Menninger, and I was mispronouncing it earlier, I'm corrected now, that there were adolescents that would reach out to you themselves, not through a parent, because their parents were not paying attention or in other ways dysfunctional?
Well, it's not that they would reach out. It's that throughout the assessment and the treatment process, they would grow. And our program also included a family therapy component as well as an assessment and treatment program. So our social workers were primarily responsible for conducting the family therapy sessions. So while they were at Menninger, they got the benefit of not just individual treatment for the teenager, but also they were a afforded the opportunity to have family treatment as well.
Mhm.
And many of them benefited from that opportunity.
I imagine in 11 years working in that environment, you had an opportunity to see some great success stories and some heartbreaking failures along the way. Do you want to give us any examples of like your best and possibly your most difficult experience?
I did see a number of success stories. I heard back from some of the teenagers after they had left the program. Many of them went on to a longer-term residential program. They graduated from that program. There was one young lady that had contacted me. She had graduated from the residential program, had gone on to college and had graduated and had become very successful. Um, Probably one of the saddest situations that I encountered was a young girl around the age of 17 who came into Menninger. She had been introduced to opiate drugs, very, very powerful, dangerous drugs by her boyfriend,
Mm,
and she was also pregnant. So what we could do for her was basically stabilize her over a couple of weeks to make sure that she did not go into extreme withdrawal.
mm.
And then we had her transferred to a longer term treatment program that could manage not only the many issues that she was facing, but also her pregnancy.
That is heartbreaking. What happened with the birth of that child? Do you know?
I did not hear.
And that's an important thing to realize as well, because those addictions can be passed along and those babies can be born in need of treatment right out of the womb.
Yes.
That's
Yeah.
pretty tragic. Let me turn you for a moment to a subject that's interesting to me because I've been doing some reading in this area. There's been a great movement in the last several years about the benefits, the medicinal and therapeutic benefits of cannabis. And of course, every state is making legislation that will either make it available medically or recreationally. And federally, cannabis is still considered to be a Schedule One drug. So there are all these conflicts, and we're kind of figuring out how we feel about it. And there seem to be a lot of very passionate opinions on both sides of the fence, the ones who will advocate for the benefits of this natural substance that is a plant that God put on the earth and all the wonderful things that can be gotten from it, and that there is no, the adamant statements are there is no harm that comes from this. It doesn't negatively impact your brain or your lungs. It's great. And then, of course, there's the other side where you'll have scientific studies that have been published that absolutely and clearly point to changes that take place, particularly in the developing brain. So I'm wondering what your experience has told you about this issue and whether there's an age beyond which these benefits may actually be something to explore and look into, or whether one side is simply wrong. What's your view on this?
Well, my view is that states that have legalized marijuana have legalized it for adults, not for adolescents.
Right.
And there's an important reason for that. And it gets back to the neuroscience, it gets back to the brain.
Mhm.
We know that the adolescent brain is a developing brain. Our brains don't become fully developed until around age 24, 25.
Mhm.
And the last part of the brain to get developed is the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for abstract reasoning and weighing pros and cons and hopefully making good decisions. That's not fully developed until late into the development process. So when you take a substance, whether it's marijuana, whether it's any other drug, and you start to introduce it into a developing brain, you run the risk of doing damage to that brain. And that's a big difference between an adolescent smoking marijuana and an adult smoking marijuana. The adolescent smoking marijuana, there's a much higher risk that they could do damage to the brain than an adult smoking marijuana who has a fully developed brain.
When you say damage, are you saying that there are structural changes that take place in the developing brain as a result of introducing this substance?
Structural as well as cognitive.
Mhm.
And the example that I would share with you is that many of the teenagers that I worked with at Menninger Clinic were smoking marijuana every day, sometimes multiple times a day. And when the psychological test results came back on those children, what I noticed was that the processing speed of their brain was below average. Their short-term memory was impaired and their motivation was very low. Now, some of these, like the processing speed of the brain, you might not notice. They might not be readily observable to you, but they're uncovered through psychological testing. So we do know that in some of these adolescents that smoking marijuana is negatively impacting the brain. Now, how extensive that is varies from child to child. How long lasting it is, it could be a while. But the bottom line is that for any adolescent whose brain is in the process of maturing and developing, it's very important that they protect that brain, that parents do everything they can to protect their child's brain, because whether it's marijuana or any other substance or even alcohol, introducing it into a developing brain carries with it a lot of risk.
And that can impact the rest of that child's life.
It can, because obviously if that use continues, there could be the risk of more damage to the brain.
Mhm.
Now, we do know also, though, that our brains have a remarkable capacity to heal themselves. So if the individual stops using the substance they were abusing,
Mhm.
the brain starts to heal itself and can make some remarkable progress.
For this layperson, can you help me understand why the developing brain would be impacted in a way that the developed brain might not be?
Simply because it is not mature and it's developing those critical connections and circuits that that child will need later in adulthood. So it's like any other thing, as it's maturing and developing, it's more vulnerable to damage.
I see.
And then once it gets fully mature, it's a little bit more resistant to damage.
Speaking of vulnerability, our children and our elderly are our two most vulnerable populations. And they were the ones that there's been so much reporting that those two populations were most severely impacted by the global pandemic that we've just come through. I listened to countless news reports that talked about the negative impact on children and adolescents because of their school life being disrupted and being on lockdown and being confined to their homes and having their social lives disrupted. And I know that mental health became a huge issue for these kids during this period of time, not just here, but worldwide, but particularly here in our country. I imagine substance use and abuse increased during that period as well. Did you see that?
No, we saw just the opposite.
Really?
During the pandemic, we saw a substantial decline in adolescent substance abuse across the board. The reason for that was partly what you noted. Kids were no longer in school.
Lack of
Uh, they
access. Yeah.
they were confined to home. They weren't involved with sports or extracurricular activities or with their peers. So across the board, we saw a substantial decline in adolescents using substances. We now have data that came out earlier this year about what happened a year after the pandemic. And what we saw was an increase in substance use as kids returned to school and their routines. Not quite to the pre-pandemic levels, but an increase, especially for alcohol use. But many of these drugs that were forced down, use went declined significantly during the pandemic, are starting to creep back up. And it'll take a few more years of research to see if we get to the levels that they were before the pandemic. So for
Interesting.
substance abuse, the pandemic drove down use. It's now starting to rebound. Mental health, we have known for over a decade that we have a crisis in the adolescent mental health area. We've known it for a decade. The pandemic, unlike what it did for substance use, did the opposite for mental health. It made it worse.
Yeah.
The kids were feeling depressed. They were feeling anxious. Their sleep patterns were disrupted. They were worried about their families and their friends. So it had a very negative effect on adolescents. The number of teenagers who contemplate suicide is extremely high.
Yeah.
Kids are suffering from depression, from loneliness, from social media influences, and we're just simply not addressing the mental health crisis within our adolescent population, and we haven't been for years.
And I'm sure parents feel overwhelmed and at a loss. I mean, the pandemic affected all of us. We had a lot of
Yeah.
struggles, and in many cases, I'm sure that parents were reeling from all of the things that we had to cope with during that period. And some kids may have gotten lost in the mix, during that period of great stress and distraction. So let's talk about what's in your book for a moment, because it's a wonderful resource that parents who might be feeling like they understand what you're talking about and it resonates with them and they understand and they agree and they're jumping up and down in their seats saying, yes, I'm in this position. I don't know what to do. I don't know where to
Yeah.
start. So what can your book offer for these parents?
Well, I kept it short. I kept it to around 100 pages because parents are busy. They don't have time to read volumes of information on this.
Right.
So I kept it to around 100 pages, but packed into it as much information as I hope parents will find helpful. There's a brief chapter on the neuroscience so that parents become a little bit more familiar with how these drugs work in the brain
Hmm.
and the importance to protect the brain.
Hmm.
There is a brief chapter on the various drugs that are out there on the street. And parents are aware of alcohol and marijuana, but they may not be aware of some of these drugs that are out there on the street. So I wanted to provide a very brief summary of the different drugs that are out there on the street that these kids have access to. I have a chapter on assessments. What assessments should you get done beyond just an addictions assessment? What other assessments, like a neuroscience assessment, a psychological assessment? What assessments should you get done to make sure that you've looked at all of the possible things that might be affecting your child?
Hmm.
I have a chapter on what the warning signs are for alcohol use and marijuana in self-injury and eating disorders, because sometimes eating disorders and self-injury will accompany a child using a substance. So it's important that parents know what these warning signs are, and I put those in the book. There's a chapter on what different type of treatments are there: inpatient, outpatient, intensive outpatient, and what those treatments are. What questions a parent should ask a treatment provider. If you're sending your child to a residential program, what are the questions you should ask that program? Because many times it's a crisis situation and parents don't think of these questions. And then there's a chapter that has additional resources in the book. So there's a lot of information, a lot of resources packed into about 100 pages that's available either as a Kindle for people who like to read on their Kindle, or as a paperback that people can use and take notes, highlight, and keep on their bookshelf in case they need it.
Did I read correctly that there's a companion workbook that goes along with it?
There is a workbook. It's a very brief workbook. I wrote that for parents to give them an opportunity to express what they're going through. It has some tips on how to handle anxiety. It has chapters where parents are given an opportunity to explore and write what they're going through. And I think one of the benefits of using that workbook is if you share it with a good friend or perhaps a counselor or a therapist, where you can get feedback on the things that
Mhm.
you have shared and the things that you have written. It's also very brief, but it has some exercises in it that I think would help parents.
Yeah, brief actually is a huge plus, I think, in a situation like this.
Yeah.
It sounds like if the home life is already problematic, to really sit down and sink your teeth into, something that's extensive might be just too daunting in the situation. And, something
Yeah.
else that crossed my mind as you were describing what's in your book is the parent also may want to take a moment and seek out some counseling for themselves, just to know how not, if you suspect, for instance, that your child is struggling with something, you're not quite sure. If you come at them and approach them in a way that's confrontational or, overwhelming, I'm going to drag you to all of these testing facilities and we're going to find out what's wrong with you. It may actually do more of a disservice to the child than help them. So for the parent first, just like, put that oxygen mask on your own face before you try to help someone else, seems like wisdom. So it's wonderful that you wrote a book for parents to help them center themselves and approach their child in a way that has the greatest chance of benefiting themselves. I'm sure you saw some overbearing parents or parents who were jumping to conclusions and maybe arriving at the wrong one.
Yeah, and parents often are working in a crisis situation when it gets out of control,
Yeah.
and then they panic. But I think the best approach to deal with this is to understand, what's going on. Knowledge is power. The more we understand, the more we feel better prepared. And I would say to every parent, because this is a very scary topic.
It
And
is.
unfortunately, a lot of parents want to stay away from it. They want to avoid it. They want to think that this can never happen to their kid. But I can say that no child is totally protected from these drugs. Every child is vulnerable to using substances. It doesn't matter where you live, urban, rural, or suburban. Doesn't matter what your level of income is. Doesn't matter what church you go to. Doesn't matter what school you send your child to. Every child is vulnerable to getting captured by these substances. And the research that we've seen that comes out every year tells us two things. Adolescents know that these drugs are available and how easy they are to get. When we ask them how easy is it to get marijuana, 80% of them tell us it's no big deal. When we ask them how easy is it to get alcohol, 80% of us tell them it's really easy. So these drugs are widely available and these kids know it. And then we ask them how harmful are these drugs? And overwhelmingly, they tell us they don't think these drugs are harmful.
Mm-hmm.
They don't think smoking marijuana every day is harmful. They don't think drinking alcohol nearly every day is harmful. So when you take two items that these drugs are readily available and kids know it, and they don't think they're harmful, that
That's
explains
that
the drug use.
underdeveloped prefrontal cortex we were talking about a
Yes,
few minutes
yes,
ago. How can they know? They're not mature enough to know. And
exactly.
it's not just the availability of the substance themselves. I know you say there's a chapter in your book that talks about what the different drugs are that are available, but those aren't even what they are anymore. There's news stories all the time about the lacing of these things with fentanyl and
Yeah.
other substances. So you may think you're putting your hands on one thing, but in fact you're ingesting or in some other way taking into your body an entirely different substance, and you could literally be dead in 5 minutes before you even realize what's happened. So it's a crucial area in which to be aware as a parent. And I know we can't keep our eyes on them every minute of the day. We send them off to school and they're going to be exposed to what they're exposed to. So providing a stable home life and a great policy of communication with your kids seems to me like the best thing that you can do. Arming yourself with this knowledge, as you say, which is power, but just creating a healthy environment for your child to develop in so that when they do go out into the world, they'll have the benefit of that to help them make a better choice while that prefrontal cortex is developing.
I think that's absolutely crucial. And when you mention communication, that's powerful. You want to be able to have those communication channels open with your child. And when we talk about communicating with our children, we're very good at listening to the words they say. So that when we're talking to each other or we're talking to children, we're very good at listening to their words, but we're not so good at listening to the feelings that are behind those words. And that's a skill that every parent can practice and learn so that when we're talking to our children, we're not just hearing the words, we're hearing those feelings, and we can reflect that back to the child. That's a skill that every parent can practice and learn. And when they do, it improves their ability to develop that strong relationship that's based on understanding and feelings with their
Mhm.
child. And that can go a
Yeah.
long way.
And something else that occurs to me for parents who they have a baby and they have to raise that baby and everything about them, their hormones change, everything about them is about protecting and covering for that child. And when they get to a point where they start to individuate and they start to go out and experience other things that are not under that parent's control, it can be very difficult for the parent to make the shift that's necessary. I would imagine you've seen that. Am I on the right track there?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think it's a basic instinct that we have as parents to protect our child. And often that protection crosses over into enabling and enabling sometimes unhealthy behaviors because we're afraid. As parents, we do become afraid when we see our child, engaging in dangerous behaviors. And sometimes it's difficult to maintain the boundaries. But I continue to say that knowledge is power. It's like anything else. The earlier you recognize the warning signs, the earlier you can intervene and have a better chance of solving the problem before it escalates and gets out of control and becomes a crisis.
And it's much easier said than done in so many cases, but
It,
so necessary to
yeah,
wake up to that reality. Such a
yeah,
tough adjustment to make.
yes, it
Richard,
is.
what are you doing now in your retirement? You've got the book and you are retired, and I'm sure enjoying life with your family.
Yes.
But are you continuing to? Well, here you are doing a podcast. Is there anything else you're doing in the community, like lecturing or teaching or counseling?
I'm not doing any counseling now. I've done an awful lot of these podcasts to reach out with the help of people like yourself to parents and let them know about the book and to learn more about adolescent substance abuse. I did at one time speak to some parent-teacher association to do it more on a personal basis.
Mhm.
But most of my work right now is devoted to helping get the word out about adolescent substance abuse and letting people know about this resource to help them and their families.
Yeah, what a great thing that is. There will be a link in the show notes where people can find your book on your website
Great.
and to read more about this issue. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to help you in what I think is a very important crusade to save our kids because they're literally our future. And we need to give them every chance we can, particularly to overcome the challenges that they face during this pandemic. It breaks my heart to know
Yeah.
the damage that's been done. It's a whole generation that's suffering because of that. I'm glad they got a little bit of a break during lockdown from the substance use, but
Yeah.
the harm that they suffered in that isolation may not have done them very much good at all.
Yeah.
I want to thank you for joining me today. It was a very interesting conversation, I think a very necessary one. I really hope that anybody who's listening and is finding a resonance here will go ahead and seek out the book as a first step. And did you say that there's a chapter there that has resources? So once
Yes.
reading the book, they'll know what's the first phone call that they can make or the first website they can visit to start their own journey?
Yes, there are resources at the end of the book that some people can go to the internet and hopefully find some additional information and resources they might find helpful.
I'm very grateful to Richard for joining me today and for sharing his knowledge, his expertise, and especially the information about his book. There are links in the show notes where you can get your hands on a copy of it for yourself or to share with others, should that be something that you're moved to do. Before I get to my parting thought today, I just want to let you know what's coming up in future episodes. In 2 weeks, the next episode will be with my guest, Mike Cleland, who has written a book called The Messengers. We're going to talk about owls. We're going to talk about owls and where they show up in some of the most unexpected places and what that might actually mean if you look at history and literature and references. Mike is a walking encyclopedia on this topic, and it gets stranger than you might think. So I hope you'll join me there. And after that, 2 weeks further down the road, we'll be talking with artist Kate Clark, who is a sculptor. She does full-size human animal hybrid sculptures, and she uses taxidermy in her practice. It's a fascinating conversation, and I will be showing you some of her work on my blog as well. So I hope you'll join me for those. If you're wondering what these things might have to do with each other or what they might have to do with this episode, I would encourage you to just go and take a look at either my YouTube channel or your podcast platform for an episode I did just a few months back called How to Get the Most Out of This Podcast. It's very brief, just a few minutes long, and it helps you understand why I'm doing this, what I hope it does in your life, what it does in my life, and how you can expand your mind by exposing yourself to some of these conversations, even in areas where you thought maybe you might not be interested. So give that a little listen and then come on back for another couple of episodes. See what you think. I hope you get on board the train and become an active and interactive member of this community. My parting thought today is a poem. It's by Patricia Gale, and it's called A Mother's Love Never Dies. And I think it just fits beautifully with the conversation we had today. It's a little difficult to get the rhyming pattern here, but I'm going to do my very best with it and share it with you right now. When we watched the maple seedlings fall and spiral down to the ground, we laughed, and I told you they were helicopters. Your hair in a ponytail, because for you, pigtails would not be found. You asked what a crayfish was, and I told you baby lobsters. The first time your tears fell for some boy, or the phone ringing constantly, even late at night. Being in at a certain time was no big joy. The shopping trips we took weekly. The sweet days of you being my baby girl, they're long gone, it seems. For your life now seems to be a tilt-a-whirl. You're spinning faster than milk turning into cream. On a 110-degree day in July, how many nights I've prayed and cried, wishing it was just a bad dream. Please, God, protect her. Don't let her die. Baby girl, I know more than you think. One more smoke, one more toke, no one will know. Addiction versus you wanting help and stopping the race with death's roller rink. I pray your eyes will open and someday, somehow, before it's too late and to the bottom you sink. Hear the tears that fall every night for your protection. See the heart that breaks for you daily. See the fist marks left on my pillow as I pray. I can't take it anymore. Please give me direction. I've tried and tried 7 days weekly, begging and pleading while my heart is slowly bleeding. Hiding it from family is no more, and friends I wish never found out. This thing you call your life only leads to death's door, or a white linen bed from his final shout. The mind and body of the one who gave you life decays with each day, letting go too many decisions, no manual, no instructions, only pray every night, though sleep never comes, before the horrid visions. I ask the maker of all to let no harm come to you, to guide you and remind you, a mother's love never dies. I'll leave you with that thought today. I'll once again encourage you to interact with this episode and let me know the impact that it has had in your life. I would very much appreciate that. And in the meantime, I just want to say, especially this time, thanks for listening. Come on back, and I will see you next time. Cool Gray and Studio A is a fine-tuned services production. It exists for entertainment purposes and is not intended to be used as a sole source of information or advice on any subject. Find and follow this podcast at coolgraystudios.com.